In 1960, a British multinational quietly stole Australia's favourite ice cream company. The company was called Streets. The British company was called Unilever. The deal was done in a Sydney boardroom. There was no public consultation. There was no government review. The Foreign Investment Review Board would not exist for another 16 years. The price was never published. A wounded First World War soldier named Edwin Ted Street, who had founded the company 40 years earlier in a back shed in Corrimal, took the cheque, retired to Narooma, and watched from the south coast as the company that bore his family name became a foreign asset. 66 years later, Street's ice cream is still owned by foreigners. The Paddle Pop is owned by foreigners. The Golden Gay Time is owned by foreigners. The Bubble Bill, the Splice, the polar bear that the fishermen of the Illawarra coast used to navigate home at night. All of it owned by a company headquartered in Europe. The water-based icy poles you ate as a kid, your Calippo, your lemonade icy pole, most of those are not even made in Australia anymore. They have been manufactured in factories in China since the year 2000. And in 2017, the British owners decided that even the workers at the last remaining Australian factory were too expensive. Unilever pressed the nuclear button. It applied to the Fair Work Commission to terminate the enterprise agreement at the Streets factory in Minto, southwest Sydney. The union calculated the cut to wages and conditions at 46%. 140 Australian factory workers, parents with children with mortgages, about to lose half their pay overnight. The Australian Council of Trade Unions Secretary Sally McManus called it un-Australian. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union called for a national boycott of every Streets product on every supermarket shelf in the country. Paddle Pop, Splice, Bubble Bill, Cornetto, Magnum, Viennetta, and the one that hurt the most because every Australian over 40 had grown up with the slogan, the Golden Gay Time. It's so hard to have a gay time on your own. It's harder when the company that makes them is trying to cut your dad's wages in half. The workers won. Unilever blinked on the 22nd of November 2017 and withdrew the application. The union celebrated by eating Magnums for breakfast in front of the news cameras. But here is what nobody mentioned in the headlines. The workers won the battle. Britain still owns the empire. This is how it happened. Chapter 1. The Wounded Soldier. Here is the part of the Ted Street story nobody tells. Before he was the founder of Australia's largest ice cream company, before the polar bear and the paddle pop and the back shed at Corrimal, he was a soldier on the Western Front. Edwin Ted Street was born on the 8th of August 1891 at Corrimal, New South Wales, the youngest of 10 children of Staffordshire-born parents. His father, James Street, was a coal miner. His mother, Anne, née Cooper, raised 10 children in a mining town north of Wollongong at a time when the average house in Corrimal had 2 bedrooms and a tin roof. The Australian Dictionary of Biography records every detail. By 1914, Ted and his older brothers had left the coal town. They established a farm at Leeton in southwestern New South Wales, a soldier settler scheme block on what had recently been irrigated riverina land. He was 23. He met a farmer's daughter from Western Australia named Daisy Olive Grigg. They had not yet married. Then, on the 29th of June 1916, at Kiama, on the New South Wales south coast, Ted Street enlisted as a private in the Australian Imperial Force. He was 24 years old. The First World War was 2 years old. The Battle of the Somme had begun 3 weeks earlier. 20,000 British soldiers had died on the first day. The Australian 5th Division was being chewed apart at Fromelles. The men who enlisted in June 1916 were not signing up to a great patriotic adventure. They were signing up to a meat grinder, and they knew it. Ted Street was assigned to the 45th Battalion. He served in France from 1917. He was wounded twice. The 45th Battalion was part of the 4th Division of the Australian Imperial Force. By the time Ted Street arrived in France, the battalion had already fought through Pozieres, Mouquet Farm, and Bullecourt. It would go on to fight at Messines, at the Third Battle of Ypres, which Australian soldiers came to call Passchendaele, and at the Battle of Hamel under General Monash in 1918. The 45th Battalion was disbanded in March 1919 after losing approximately 1,400 men killed and wounded across 2.5 years of continuous frontline service. The military service records do not specify exactly where or how Ted Street was wounded, but the Australian Dictionary of Biography is unambiguous. Twice wounded in France, he survived. Many of the men in the 45th Battalion did not. He was demobilised in July 1919. He came home to Corrimal. The town was unchanged. The coal mines were still operating. His family was still there. His Western Australian sweetheart, Daisy, had waited for him. They married on the 7th of June 1921 at the Leeton Methodist Church. They would never have children. And then, in 1920, a year before the wedding, in a back shed in Corrimal, the wounded soldier began hand-churning frozen custards. He was selling them to neighbours alongside sweets, cakes, and bottles of lemonade. There is no documented reason why he chose ice cream over any other small business. There is no recorded recipe from his Staffordshire mother. There is no business plan. The Australian Dictionary of Biography simply records that he established a grocer's shop and in 1920 began hand-churning frozen custards. His first paying customer was a Corrimal local named Mr. Pop Winks. That name is in the heritage record. Pop Winks, the first man to ever buy a Streets ice cream. The wounded soldier had found something he could do. Chapter 2. The Cream of the Coast. The Illawarra coast of New South Wales in the early 1920s was one of the richest dairying districts in Australia. The lush grass between Jamberoo and Narooma produced milk that was thicker, creamier and higher in butterfat than the milk from drier inland regions. Ted Street had grown up there. He knew the dairy farmers. He bought their milk. Within a year of selling his first frozen custards, Ted had outgrown his hand-cranked churn. He attached a 1-horsepower engine to it, then a 1-horsepower motorbike to handle the deliveries. By 1923, he had partnered with his older brother Daniel Street, who was the mechanical brains of the operation. The two brothers opened a shop in Corrimal called Illawarra Delicacies. The shareholders of the new business were not just the two brothers. They included Ted's wife Daisy, Daniel's wife Frances, and a family friend. The Streets Ice Cream Company, from the very beginning, was a marriage operation as much as a brother's operation. Daisy was not a decorative wife. According to John Street, Ted's nephew, speaking to the Illawarra Mercury in 2020, Daisy was the foreman of the manufacturing floor. She ran the back of the operation. She made the calls about production. Ted was the front of the shop. Daisy was the engine room. She held that role until the 1950s. Their first commercial product was called the Penny Pinky, a small strawberry-flavoured ice cream in a cone, sold from travelling carts that worked the streets of Corrimal and the beach towns up and down the coast. Cost 1 penny. The name said everything about the product. Cheap, sweet, summer. The Penny Pinky was a hit. It outsold the brick streets sold in the Corrimal shop, which were the standard product format of the day. Solid rectangular blocks of vanilla ice cream wrapped in cardboard, eaten quickly because there were no preservatives, and Australian summer kitchens had no freezers. The slogan came in the mid-1920s, the cream of the coast. Ted Street travelled the south coast on weekends in his motorbike sidecar, promoting his product town by town. The cream of the coast meant something. It meant that the milk in the ice cream came from cows grazing within an hour of the Pacific Ocean, on grass kept green year-round by a coastal climate, in one of the most productive dairy belts on the planet. By 1934, Ted had enough capital to make the move that turned a backshed business into an empire. He bought the Corrimal Iceworks at the corner of Tarrawanna Road and the Prince's Highway. The iceworks gave him industrial-scale refrigeration. The same year, Streets Ice Cream Limited was registered as a company in Sydney. The Streets brothers had moved from running a shop to running a factory, and on the wall of that factory, in a moment of marketing genius for a small business in a coal town, Ted Street installed a neon sign. It was the first moving neon sign in Wollongong. It featured a polar bear holding an ice cream cone, with its tongue moving in a licking motion across the cone. The slogan beneath the bear read, "Bear in mind, Streets Ice Cream." Technically, the bear's arm did not move. The lighting alternated to create the illusion of motion. But to a 1934 Australian who had never seen a neon sign animate, the polar bear looked like it was alive. The sign was visible from the Pacific Ocean. Barbara Street, a member of the Street family interviewed by the Illawarra Mercury in 2020, recalled what the fishermen of the Illawarra coast used to say. The fishermen used to love the polar bear sign. They could see it from miles offshore. They knew that if they could see the polar bear's light, they were on their way home. A wounded soldier's neon sign became a lighthouse for fishermen. Chapter 3. The Brother, the Wives, and the Bridge. Then, in 1939, Ted Street did what every successful Australian regional manufacturer eventually does. He went to Sydney. The Sydney market in 1939 was approximately 10 times the size of the Wollongong market. The Streets brothers set up a distribution depot at Bexley in southern Sydney. Ice cream was shipped from Corrimal by refrigerated van and stored at Bexley for delivery to corner shops, milk bars, and railway kiosks across the metropolitan area. The Second World War interrupted everything. Sugar rationing in 1942 restricted Streets, the same way it restricted Peter's ice cream further north. Australian families were limited to half a pound of sugar a week, but Streets, like Peter's, was treated as an essential dairy supply by the Australian government. The factory at Corrimal did not close. The ice cream kept being made. The cabinets in the corner shops kept humming. After the war ended, Ted made his next move. In 1946, he opened a Sydney factory at Torella, an industrial inner southern suburb. The Torella plant would be the manufacturing heart of Streets ice cream for the next 50 years. The same year, 1946, he launched his first stick ice cream. It was called The Heart, a vanilla ice cream on a stick, dipped in chocolate, shaped roughly like a heart. The Heart was the precursor to everything Streets would become. Before the Heart, ice cream was sold in bricks, in scoops, in cones. After the Heart, ice cream was a portable, packaged consumer product you could buy at a counter, eat while walking, and consume without a bowl or a spoon. Ted Street was 4 years too early. The Heart never became the cultural artifact that the paddle pop would become. But the engineering work, the chocolate coating that did not crack, the stick that did not snap, was done at Torella in 1946, and Streets had figured it out before any of its competitors had. In 1950, Ted opened a second factory at River Street, Moruya, further down the south coast. The Moruya plant was meant to handle south coast milk supply and reduce the load on Corrimal. It lasted 4 years. In April 1954, the Turos River Bridge collapsed. The bridge was the only road link between the Moruya factory and the dairy farms that supplied it. When the bridge went down, the milk did not arrive. Streets had no way to truck enough product north or south fast enough to keep the factory profitable. The Moruya plant closed. It never reopened. There is a marker on the side of the Princes Highway near Turos today commemorating the bridge collapse. There is no marker for the Streets factory that died because of it. By the mid-1950s, the company had a Corrimal factory, a Torella factory, a Bexley depot, a national distribution network, and a portfolio of products that included the Heart, the Penny Pinky, and the standard family bricks. The next product to launch was an engineer's project designed by a man who had said no to NASA. Chapter 4. The Man Who Said No to NASA. The single most important product innovation in the history of Streets ice cream was invented by a Street family member who turned down a job at the United States Space Program to make ice cream in his uncle's factory. His name was Ron Street. He was Ted Street's nephew, the son of Ted's brother and business partner Daniel. Ron was an engineer. He had trained in Australia in mechanical engineering, and in the 1950s, when the Cold War space race was just beginning to spool up, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration of the United States made him a job offer. According to an interview Ron gave to the Daily Telegraph in 2013, on the 60th anniversary of his most famous product, he turned NASA down. He preferred to join the family ice cream business in Sydney. He became Street's technical director. In 1953, Ron Street designed a new ice cream. The brief was simple: develop something that would compete with the rival Peter's ice cream products. Peter's at that time was much larger than Street's and was eating Street's market share in the corner shops of Sydney and Queensland. Ron's design was, on paper, unremarkable: a chocolate-flavoured ice cream moulded into a flat paddle shape with a wooden stick at the base. The stick was the trick. It meant the ice cream could be eaten without a bowl, without a wrapper to fight with, without melting onto your hand. The paddle shape meant the chocolate flavour came through evenly with every bite. He called it the paddle pop. His uncle Ted hated it. This is documented. Ron Street, in his 2013 interview at the age of 88, said that when he presented the paddle pop to his uncle, Ted's response was that it would be a 9-day wonder, a novelty, something that would sell for a week and then disappear. The paddle pop launched in 1953. It took off like wildfire. The factory at Corrimal had to put on an extra shift of workers to keep up with demand in the first 6 months. The original chocolate flavour was so popular that Streets did not bother launching a second flavour for 2 years. When they did, they launched vanilla, then caramel, then rainbow. By the end of the 20th century, more than 90 million paddle pops had been sold in Australia. Per capita, it became the best-selling ice cream in the world. Ted Street's 9-day wonder lasted 47 years and counting. There is one final detail in the Paddle Pop story that matters for what was coming. The shaggy-maned Paddle Pop lion mascot, the cartoon lion with the slogan, "I'm the lion who loves Paddle Pops," was introduced in 1960. The lion was not invented by Ron Street or by Ted Street. The lion was introduced by the new owners of Street's Ice Cream, the British. The lion became one of the most recognised mascots in Australian children's marketing for the next 50 years. He appeared in animated television commercials. He appeared on the wooden Paddle Pop sticks themselves in the form of the iconic Lick a Prize competitions, where children would lick a Paddle Pop down to the wooden stick to reveal whether they had won a free replacement. The Paddle Pop stick, separated from its ice cream, became one of the most common craft objects in Australian primary schools. Generations of children built model bridges, picture frames and Christmas decorations out of the leftover sticks. In 2005, Unilever launched a spin-off Paddle Pop dairy snack. In 2010, the company announced that the Paddle Pop would be reduced in size by 15%. Streets framed the reduction as a health initiative designed to lower the calorie content for children. The Australian press framed it differently. The 2010 reduction came at the same time as a wave of shrinkflation across Australian consumer goods, where manufacturers reduced product size while maintaining the same price to absorb food cost inflation. The Paddle Pop you ate in 2011 was smaller than the Paddle Pop you ate in 1985. The wrapper looked the same. The price had increased. Since the year 2000, Paddle Pops have been manufactured at factories in China, as well as in Australia. The Australian factory at Minto still produces the cream-based varieties for the Australian and New Zealand markets. But the brand itself, as a global asset, is now distributed in approximately 20 countries. Chapter 5. The British Buy-In. In 1960, the Unilever Corporation of London and Rotterdam purchased Street's Ice Cream. Unilever in 1960 was already one of the largest consumer goods companies in the world. It had been formed in 1929 by the merger of the British soap maker Lever Brothers, founded by William Lever in 1885, and the Dutch margarine company Margarine Unie. By 1960, Unilever owned hundreds of brands across food, soap, detergent, personal care and ice cream. Its global ice cream operation was called Heartbrand, and it operated under different names in different countries. Walls in Britain, Algida in Italy, Cuban in Brazil, Good Humour in the United States. In Australia, the Heartbrand name was Streets. The 1960 acquisition was part of a broader Unilever push into the Southern Hemisphere ice cream market. The company had been buying up regional ice cream brands across the British Commonwealth for a decade. In each market, the strategy was the same: acquire the dominant local brand, keep the local name and packaging, integrate the manufacturing into the global Heartbrand supply chain, and use the local brand's heritage as a marketing asset against any new entrants. Ted Street was 69 years old when the British arrived. He had founded the company 40 years earlier in his back shed. He had survived 2 world wars, sugar rationing, a bridge collapse that destroyed a factory, and 40 years of physical labour in a manufacturing business. By 1960, he was tired. There were no children to inherit the business. His brother Daniel had retired. His nephew Ron Street was still running the engineering side, but Ron would leave the company 5 years after the Unilever deal closed. Ron told the Daily Telegraph in 2013 that he had left because the corporate culture under Unilever was no longer the family operation he had joined. Ted sold. He took the cheque and retired to Narooma on the south coast with Daisy. The terms of the 1960 sale were never made public. There is no contemporary press coverage of the deal that survives in any accessible Australian newspaper archive. The transaction happened quietly on a corporate timeline between an Anglo-Dutch multinational and a small Australian family company. The Australian government did not intervene. There was no public consultation. There was no Foreign Investment Review Board ruling. The Foreign Investment Review Board would not be established until 1976, 16 years after the deal closed. It was, in 1960 Australian terms, a routine transaction. A small family company sold to a large foreign one. The brand stayed, the factory stayed, the workers stayed. Only the owners changed. In 1970, 10 years after the deal, the Australian government recognised Ted Street's contribution to the dairy industry with a national honour. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, an OBE. The man who had hand-churned custards in a backshed in a coal town 50 years earlier was now a Queen-recognised dignitary. He spent the rest of his life on philanthropic work in the Narooma district. He died on the 10th of August 1975, 2 days after his 84th birthday. The cause of death was Parkinson's disease. Daisy outlived him by 15 years. She died in 1990, having watched the brand her husband founded grow into Australia's favourite ice cream and then disappear into a foreign-owned multinational. She never gave a public interview about how she felt about the sale. The Street family is not known to have publicly second-guessed the decision either. But the company that came out the other end of the 1960 sale was a different animal from the one Ted Street had built. The polar bear stayed. The slogan changed. The cream of the coast was retired. Heart brand standards came in. And the products that defined Streets for the next 40 years were no longer Ted Street's ideas. They were Unilever's ideas, executed at Torella, with Ron Street's old engineering team carrying them out for as long as they remained at the company. The British were now in charge. Chapter 6. The Gay Time, the Bubble Bill, and the Magnum. The first product Unilever launched under the Street's name in 1959 was the Gay Time. A note on the name. The word gay in 1959 meant carefree, joyous, light-hearted. The modern meaning of the word, to denote homosexuality, had not yet entered widespread Australian usage. The Gay Time was named for the feeling of carefree joy that came with eating an ice cream. The marketing reflected the original meaning. The packaging was bright. The advertising featured happy people eating ice cream at the beach. Originally, the Gay Time was strawberry ice cream encased in vanilla ice cream, covered in chocolate, then rolled in shortcake biscuit crumbs. By the 1970s, the toffee version had been added. By the late 1970s, the toffee version had taken over and become known as the Golden Gay Time. The strawberry version was discontinued. The slogan that defined the brand for the next 30 years was launched in the 1980s. As the cultural meaning of the word had shifted, Unilever's marketing team in Sydney had a choice. They could rename the product, or they could lean into the double meaning. They leaned in. It's so hard to have a gay time on your own. It is one of the most quoted advertising slogans in Australian history. It works at both registers. The original meaning, that ice cream is a social pleasure best shared, and the post-1980s meaning, a wink at the gay community that had grown up eating Gay Times. Unilever did not back down from the name when the cultural pressure came. In 2021, a Sydney man who identified himself as Brian launched a Change.org petition, demanding Streets rename the Golden Gay Time. The petition gathered approximately 1,000 signatures before stalling. A counter-petition, titled Save the Golden Gay Time, gathered more. Pedestrian.tv ran an article headlined 5 out of 5 gays in our office reckon calls to rename Golden Gay Times are, quite frankly, homophobic. Streets issued a statement explaining the history of the name and confirming it would not change. The Gay Time is still on the shelf. The slogan is still used. The 1980s wink is still active. The other major product of the Unilever era launched in 1985. Bubble Bill, designed in the United States by Unilever's Good Humour division and adopted globally across the Heart brand network. Strawberry ice cream forming a cowboy's face with a chocolate hat featuring a bullet hole, caramel moustache details, and, most distinctively, a bubblegum nose. The wordplay was on Buffalo Bill, the 19th century American Wild West showman. In Australia, the Bubble Bill became one of Street's bestsellers. In 2007, the design was updated with a layer of dark chocolate on the reverse of the ice cream. Otherwise, the cowboy with the gumball nose has been on Australian shelves continuously for 40 years. Splice launched in 1962. Pineapple ice with a vanilla ice cream centre. Calippo, the water-based icy pole in a cylindrical sleeve, launched in 1980. Cornetto, the wafer cone with the soft-serve top, was a global Unilever product imported into Australia from the European Heart brand factories. Viennetta, the layered cream cake ice cream, came from the same network. Magnum, the chocolate-enrobed luxury bar that would become Unilever's global flagship ice cream product, launched in Australia in the 1990s. By the mid-1980s, Streets in Australia owned a brand portfolio that included almost every iconic ice cream product the average Australian could name. And in the early 1980s, Streets bought its last serious Australian competitor. The Adelaide Milk Supply Cooperative Limited, universally known as AMSCOL, had been founded in 1922. in Carrington Street, Adelaide. It was a dairy cooperative formed by 579 South Australian milk producers who had voted to purchase an existing milk distribution business, so the supply chain could be controlled from farm to delivery. By 1924, the Amscol factory was making ice cream as well as bottled milk. Its products included the Eskimo pie, the same chocolate-coated vanilla bar that had been invented in the United States in 1922, and a range of bricks, tins, and later plastic tub ice creams sold across South Australia. The Amscol slogan was, "It's a food, not a fad." For 3 generations of Adelaide families, Amscol ice cream was Friday night dinner. Takeaway fish and chips, then a sliced brick of Amscol vanilla served with preserved peaches. The brand was as embedded in South Australian working class life as Streets was in New South Wales. In the early 1980s, Amscol was struggling. The dairy cooperative model that had built the company in the 1920s was unviable in the deregulated Australian dairy market of the 1980s. Streets, under Unilever's checkbook, bought the entire company. The Amscol brand was retired. The Carrington Street factory in Adelaide was eventually demolished and the land redeveloped for housing. The South Australian production was consolidated into the Torella plant in Sydney. By the late 1980s, the only ice cream brands left standing in Australia at any meaningful scale were Streets, Peters, and Buller. Streets and Peters were both foreign-owned by then. Buller, a Victorian cooperative, was the only major Australian-owned ice cream maker left. Chapter 7. The Torella factory closes. In 1996, after 50 years of continuous production, the Torella factory in southern Sydney closed. The Torella plant had been Ted Street's first Sydney factory. It had launched The Heart in 1946. It had produced the first paddle pops in 1953. It had been the heart of the Streets manufacturing operation during the Unilever takeover, through the gay time era, through the Amscol acquisition. Thousands of Sydney workers had passed through its gates across half a century. Production moved to a new facility at Minto in southwest Sydney. The Minto plant was larger, more automated, and designed for the Heart brand era product portfolio that was now coming through the Unilever pipeline. The relocation was framed as a modernisation. To the workers at Torella, it was a redundancy event. The Corrimal factory, the original 1934 iceworks at the corner of Tarrawanna Road, and the Prince's Highway, the one with the polar bear neon sign that had guided fishermen home, sat vacant for years after the Torella relocation. It was eventually demolished. The site is now residential and commercial development. There is no plaque, no heritage listing for the polar bear. The site of the moving neon sign that had been the first of its kind in Wollongong is now indistinguishable from any other suburban arterial road in the Illawarra. By the time the Torella plant closed, the second major shift in Streets manufacturing had already begun. Around the year 2000, Unilever made a decision about the water-based product range that Streets would never publicly advertise. The paddle pop water-based varieties, the lemonade icy poles, the Calippo, the Zupa Duper style cylindrical ice blocks, would no longer be manufactured in Australia. They would be made in China. The decision was rational from Unilever's perspective. Water-based products did not require a dairy supply chain. They could be manufactured anywhere with sugar, flavouring, food colouring, and a freezer line. The Chinese manufacturing cost was a fraction of the Australian cost. The cold chain from a Chinese factory to a Sydney warehouse was no more expensive than the cold chain from Minto to Brisbane. Australians did not notice. The paddle pop wrapper still said Streets. The Calippo still had the Streets logo. The product looked identical to what it had been in 1985. But the lemonade icy pole you ate at a school athletics carnival in 2010 was made in a factory in Shanghai, not in a factory in Sydney. The Calippo your kids ate at the cricket in 2015 had crossed the Pacific Ocean before reaching their hands. The Australian-made label, by the late 1990s, applied only to the cream-based products. Magnum, Paddle Pop Chocolate, Bubble-O Bill, Golden Gay Time. The icy poles had gone offshore. Inside the Minto factory in southwest Sydney, the workforce shrank. From thousands at Torella in the 1980s, the headcount at Minto by the late 2000s was approximately 200. The Australian ice cream industry, once one of the largest manufacturing sectors in the country by employment, had been compressed into a single suburban factory. And then in 2017, Unilever decided that even that was too expensive. Chapter 8. The Nuclear Button. The streets boycott of 2017 is the most important consumer industrial action of the past decade in Australia, and most Australians have already half forgotten it. The negotiations between Unilever and the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union over the new enterprise bargaining agreement at the Minto factory had been running for 16 months by the time they collapsed in July 2017. The two sides had reached an in-principle agreement. The workers voted it down 132 to 9. Unilever's response was to push the nuclear button. In August 2017, the company filed an application with the Fair Work Commission to terminate the existing enterprise agreement entirely. Termination under Australian industrial law would have meant that the workers reverted to minimum award conditions. The award is the legal floor, the wages and conditions below which it is illegal to pay any worker in that industry. Award conditions for food manufacturing in 2017 were significantly below what the streets workers had been earning under their enterprise agreement. The AMW calculated the gap at 46%. Unilever disputed the figure publicly. A Unilever spokesman told The New Daily on the 2nd of October 2017 that the suggestion of a 46% reduction had no basis in fact. The company said its goal was to keep making Streets ice cream products in Australia, but that the Minto factory lacked the flexibility needed to run a seasonal business and was too costly to operate. The killer statistic Unilever provided was this: it was approximately 30% cheaper to import a Magnum Classic ice cream made in Europe into Australia, including 16,000 kilometres of frozen transport, than to manufacture the same product at Minto. The AMW's response was to escalate publicly. The union had watched this exact playbook run before. In 2015, the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union had been gutted at Origin when the Fair Work Commission granted a termination application. In 2016, the AMW itself had been gutted at the Griffin coal mine in Western Australia under the same mechanism. The union estimated that enterprise bargaining agreement terminations in Australia had risen from 156 in 2014 to 517 in 2016. A trend was forming. Big companies were learning to use Fair Work as a tool against organised labour. Steve Murphy, the AMW's New South Wales secretary, gave the press the line that would frame the entire dispute. Every Australian worker faces the risk that if their employer hits the nuclear button, they could too lose their wages and their conditions. In late October 2017, the AMW launched a national consumer boycott of every Streets product: Paddle Pop, Splice, Bubble O Bill, Cornetto, Magnum, Viennetta, Calippo, Golden Gay Time, the full range across every supermarket and convenience store in Australia. The Australian Council of Trade Unions Secretary Sally McManus backed the boycott on the 2nd of November. It is un-Australian to cut workers' pay. We are calling on the people of Australia to make this a streets-free summer. We have 150 Australian families, parents, children, that will suffer because their wages are going to be cut by 50% if we let this very profitable multinational get away with cutting workers' pay. The summer of 2017 was being framed by Australia's peak trade union body as a referendum on foreign multinational ownership of an Australian icon. The reference point everybody used was the Carlton and United Breweries dispute of 2016. Kirby had outsourced its electrical maintenance work, and the affected union had launched a consumer boycott of every QB beer brand: Victoria Bitter, Carlton Draft, Crown Lager. The boycott had worked. QB had backed down within months. The unions believed the Streets boycott could replicate the win. Unilever held the line through October and most of November. The company released a statement claiming the boycott would only hurt workers and local manufacturing. Industry commentators, including the marketing academic Gary Mortimer of Queensland University of Technology, predicted that consumer boycotts of impulse purchase ice cream would not work. Ice cream is a low-attention purchase, and shoppers would not pay enough conscious attention at the freezer cabinet to honour the boycott. The data over the next 6 weeks said otherwise. The Streets Free Summer hashtag trended on Australian Twitter through October and November. Supermarket convenience aisle photographs showing customers leaving the freezer empty-handed circulated on social media. The boycott reached visibility levels the CUB action had taken months to achieve. Then, on the 22nd of November 2017, Unilever blinked. The company withdrew the application to terminate the enterprise agreement. The 46% pay cut was off the table. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union called it a huge victory. The union celebrated the win in the most Australian way possible. The AMW's Steve Murphy and ACTU's Sally McManus gathered with the Streets factory workers outside the Minto plant and ate Golden Gay Times and Magnums for breakfast in front of the press cameras. A photograph from that morning shows them all laughing. It is one of the few unambiguously joyful images in the history of modern Australian industrial relations. But here is what the photograph does not show. The Streets workers had won the battle of November 2017. The 46% pay cut did not happen. But everything that had brought Unilever to the nuclear button in the first place was still true. The Minto factory was still more expensive to operate than the European and Asian factories Unilever owned. The water-based products were still being made in China. The cream-based products were still made by a workforce that, while saved from an immediate pay cut, was operating in a manufacturing economy where their factory could be closed entirely at any time. The 2017 boycott did not save Streets from the British. The Streets workers had never been at war with Britain. They had been at war with one Fair Work Commission application. They won that war. But the deeper structural reality that Australia's favourite ice cream brand was owned by a foreign multinational with a global supply chain and quarterly earnings calls in London, that did not change. Chapter 9. The Demerger. In 2024, under shareholder pressure to focus on its core consumer health and personal care businesses, Unilever announced the largest corporate restructure in its history. The Anglo-Dutch giant would spin off its entire global ice cream division. Magnum, Walls, Cornetto, Ben & Jerry's, Streets, Algida, Kaibon, Good Humour, the entire Heartbrand network, and every regional ice cream subsidiary Unilever owned across more than 80 countries. The reasons given to investors were straightforward. Ice cream is capital intensive. It requires cold chain logistics that drag down corporate operating margins. It is seasonal, which makes quarterly revenue forecasts difficult. And it does not benefit from the same R&D synergies that Unilever's core personal care portfolio enjoys. The new company would be named the Magnum Ice Cream Company, headquartered in Amsterdam and London. Approximately 7.9 billion euros in annual revenue, 3 million freezers worldwide. Products distributed in 80 countries. The Magnum Ice Cream Company is not Unilever, but it is also not Australian. It is a global multinational that happens to own an Australian regional brand, the same way it owns Cornetto in Italy and Walls in the United Kingdom and Algida in Greece. The Australian brand has been demoted from being Unilever's Australian asset to being one of dozens of regional names inside an independent global ice cream company. The demerger completed in November 2025. In the months leading up to the demerger, TMICC made one large investment in the Minto factory, a 35 million Australian dollar upgrade, new automation, advanced manufacturing technology, refurbished offices. The investment was announced as a vote of confidence in Australian manufacturing. The Magnum Ice Cream Company's Australia and New Zealand Managing Director Scott Mingle told the press that the investment reflected the company's long-term commitment to local manufacturing. It was, simultaneously, the kind of investment that any global ice cream company would have made in any of its regional production facilities to keep that facility competitive. The Minto plant produces cream-based products for the Australian and New Zealand markets. It cannot easily be replaced by a Chinese or European factory because cream-based ice cream does not freeze ship well across long distances. The $35 million investment was a recognition of that fact. But the deeper structural reality of Streets ice cream in late 2025 is what it has been since 1960, an Australian heritage brand owned by a foreign multinational that uses that heritage as a marketing asset. The Paddle Pop wrapper still says Australia's favourite ice cream. The Golden Gay Time advertising still uses Australian voices and Australian beaches. The Buffalo Bill is still drawn as a cowboy, but the iconography is now blurred between American Wild West and Australian Outback in ways that nobody at the company seems to want to clarify. The Magnum Ice Cream Company's website carries the Streets brand history. It mentions Ted Street and the backshed in Corrimal. It does not mention that Ted Street was a wounded First World War veteran. It does not mention that the polar bear was a lighthouse for fishermen. It does not mention that Ron Street turned down NASA. It does not mention the 2017 boycott. The corporate history is sanitized. The version of Ted Street that the modern company presents is a generic founder. The version of the company that he founded is a generic Australian success story. The version of the company that exists today is a generic multinational asset. Ted Street is still the founder. Daisy Street is still the co-founder. They just no longer own any of it. Chapter 10. The polar bear is still on the packet. Stand on the corner of Tarawona Road and the Prince's Highway at Corrimal today. There is nothing left of the original Streets ice cream factory. The 1934 iceworks has been demolished. The polar bear neon sign, the first moving neon sign in Wollongong, the lighthouse that the fishermen used to find their way home, is gone. There is no marker, no plaque, no heritage centre. Drive 30 minutes south to Moruya, the site of the 1950 Streets factory at River Street, closed in 1954 when the Turos Bridge collapsed, is similarly unmarked. The town has moved on. Drive 2 hours north to Sydney. The Turella factory, where the first paddle pop was made in 1953, closed in 1996. The site has been redeveloped. There is no plaque. Drive west to Minto. The current Streets ice cream factory is a low-rise industrial building in a southwest Sydney suburb. 201 workers as of 2017, 400 as of the 2025 expansion. Cream-based ice cream products manufactured for the Australian and New Zealand markets. The plant is owned by the Magnum Ice Cream Company, headquartered in Europe. Drive 200 kilometres south to Narooma. Ted Street retired here with Daisy in 1960 after the Unilever sale. He died here in 1975. He is buried in a Narooma cemetery. The plot is unremarkable. There is no statue, no museum, and no annual Ted Street Day. Streets ice cream is still Australia's #1 ice cream brand by volume. The Paddle Pop is still per capita the best-selling ice cream in the world. Australians still eat approximately 70 million Paddle Pops a year, plus tens of millions of Gay Times and Bubble-O Bills and Splices and Magnums and Cornettos and Viennettas. The annual revenue of the Australian operation runs into the hundreds of millions. But the company that owns it is not Australian. The 2017 boycott did not change that. The 2025 demerger did not change that. The $35 million Minto upgrade did not change that. The water-based icy poles, your Calippo, your lemonade icy pole, are still made in China. They have been since the year 2000. The brand survived. The empire is somewhere else. Ted Street churned frozen custards in a backshed in Corrimal in 1920 because he was a wounded soldier who needed something to do with his hands when he came home from France. His first customer was a man called Pop Winks. His wife Daisy ran the manufacturing floor for 30 years. His brother Daniel built the machines. His nephew Ron turned down NASA to invent the Paddle Pop. The factory he built had a polar bear on the wall that the fishermen used as a lighthouse. None of those people own a single share of the company that bears their name. The polar bear is still on the packet. The empire is not.